My name is Angelo. I have been a doctor for years, specialized in general surgery and intensive care. Throughout my career, I have entered operating rooms that seemed like true battlefields against time. I have witnessed cases where medicine had every possible resource, and yet the outcome was not what we expected. But I have also lived through situations where, in the absence of scientific explanations, something greater seemed to take over. Today, I am going to share with you one of those. Stories that never left my memory. Stories that remind me, every day, that medicine goes beyond scalpels, protocols, and diagnoses. There are moments when we are simply witnesses to something unexplainable. That night, when I entered the operating room, I had no idea I was about to live through one of the most remarkable episodes of my professional life. I was exhausted, coming off a nearly 36-hour shift, but the urgency of that case demanded all of my attention. I knew a young man's life was hanging by a thread, and every second could define his destiny. I am not the kind of doctor who usually talks much about his personal life, but there is something you may need to understand before hearing this story. I have always deeply believed in science. I was trained to trust numbers, exams, evidence, and to some extent that faith in logic sustained me through countless nights on duty. However, when life decides to surprise us, even the strongest truths we've learned can tremble. That was how that night began. I remember walking into the hospital and feeling the tension in the air. Nurses were restless. The nursing technicians were running back and forth, and the patient was already being prepped for emergency surgery. There was no time for long conversations, only for quick decisions. I still recall the first time I saw him lying on the gurney. He was a young man, just over 20, pale, with his eyes closed, his breathing short and irregular. The monitor already showed alarming. Signs. He had lost a significant amount of blood, and at that moment, it was as if his body were suspended on a thin line between life and death. As I was scrubbing in, a nurse approached me and whispered, "Doctor, the family is desperate. They want to know if he will survive." I looked at her, took a deep breath, and said, "Tell them we will do everything we possibly can." That wasn't just a protocol response, it was the truth. But inside, I knew we were facing an uneven fight, and that was precisely what made it even more significant. When hope seems minimal, every gesture in the operating room becomes a battle for life. And it was that night, in front of that patient, that science and the unexplainable crossed paths. That night, I was faced with a scene I had never imagined witnessing. The patient was already on the operating table, and his life seemed to be slipping away with each heartbeat. The monitor beeped irregularly, the numbers dropped, and everyone in the room knew time was against us. I remember clearly the heavy silence that lingered for a few seconds, broken only by the sounds of the machines and the hurried footsteps of the team. The young man's breathing was unstable, his body already showing signs of collapse, and the eyes of the professionals around me reflected the same question I carried inside. Would we still be able to save him? And before I continue this story, I need to ask something from you who are watching me. This channel only grows because you participate actively. So, be part of this chain. Subscribe now, activate the notifications, and write in the comments a phrase I carry with me in every case like this. I believe in miracles. I need at least 100 comments for YouTube to deliver this video to more people. and I know you can help me with that." Back to that night. The atmosphere in the operating room was one of extreme urgency. The anesthesia team was ready, nurses were checking instruments, and technicians organized every detail. It was a silent choreography of hands that knew they could not make mistakes. Yet, even with all that synchronicity, there was a shadow hovering over us, the feeling that we could lose that young man at any moment. I felt a tightness in my chest when I touched the patient for the first time. His skin was cold, pale. His weakened body revealed the silent struggle that had lasted hours before reaching us. He had suffered severe internal bleeding, and his body was already collapsing. The anesthesiologist gave me a firm look and said, "Doctor, the vital signs are dropping fast. We need to act now." I nodded and answered without hesitation, "Let's begin." Right there, in that instant, the life of a young man was literally in our hands. And at that moment, I noticed something different in the room. I cannot explain it scientifically, but there was an almost palpable energy present, as if something greater were in the room. Even with all the pressure, a part of me felt we were not alone in that surgery. As the minutes passed, the monitor issued increasingly worrying alerts. Each beep sounded like a cruel reminder of how close we were to the limit. The team was in total concentration, but I could see in each person's eyes the mixture of fear and hope. In my mind, I repeated, "He cannot give up now. Not here, not today." And in that scenario where science showed its limits, the unexpected began to show signs that it was about to happen. Before opening the surgical field, my mind was invaded by an image that has never left me. The look on that young man's mother's face. Just before he was taken into the room, she held his hand so tightly it seemed as though she wanted to transfer her own life to him. Tears ran silently down her face, but her eyes shone with unshakable faith. When I approached, she lifted her head, still with her fingers interlaced with his, and asked me in a low voice, "Doctor, will he make it?" It was one of the hardest questions I have ever heard. Not because I didn't know the severity, but because at that moment I didn't want to give a cold answer based only on statistics. I took a deep breath, touched her shoulder, and said, "He is in good hands. We will do everything within our reach." She closed her eyes, as if that phrase were the last thread of hope she could hold on to. The young man, named Gabriel, was only 23 years old, an engineering student, full of plans for the future, described by friends as someone always willing to help. That night, a car accident had radically changed the course of his story. The collision had been strong, and although he had survived the initial impact, silent internal bleeding now put his life at risk. While the team prepared the instruments, I thought about how often we don't see the faces behind medical statistics. For many, he could have been just another polytrauma patient with abdominal hemorrhage. But for that mother waiting outside, he was everything. Son, friend, future. And it was. Precisely that human weight that made the responsibility so crushing. Inside the operating room, there was a curious contrast. On one side, the almost mechanical precision of the team, each movement calculated, each action synchronized. On the other, the vulnerability of a young body, fragile in that moment, silently fighting for life. The anesthesiologist monitored the vital signs, tension stamped on his face. One of the nurses murmured to me, "Doctor, he's so young. This cannot be the end." Those words echoed inside me. This wasn't just a surgery. It was the attempt to save a story that was only just beginning. As I scrubbed my hands and prepared to begin, I remembered something my mentor during residency used to say. Never forget that each patient is more than the body in front of you. He carries dreams, memories, and people who depend on him. And at that moment, that phrase made even more sense. Gabriel wasn't just a clinical case. He was a beloved son, a promising student. Someone who still had an entire life ahead of him. When the doors of the room closed, I realized we were isolated from the outside world. Outside, the family prayed in silence. Inside, we were about to fight a battle against time, against blood loss, and against all the statistics that, at that moment, were against us. And amid that tension, something inside me said this would not be an ordinary surgery. The first incisions were made, and soon the magnitude of the challenge ahead became clear. Gabriel's abdomen was filled with blood. The hemorrhage was extensive and diffuse, a sign that multiple vessels had been compromised in the accident. The surgical field barely allowed us to visualize the structures clearly. It was as if life itself were draining before our eyes. The anesthesiologist raised his voice so everyone could hear. Pressure dropping, 70/40. That phrase sounded like an alarm inside my mind. Time was no longer just precious, it was decisive. I quickly commanded, "Immediate suction! I need a clear field now." The nurses obeyed promptly, but the blood flow seemed endless. With every second that passed, Gabriel's body grew paler. His young and strong heart tried to resist, but the monitors betrayed the uneven battle. The operating room, normally filled with technical conversations and quick instructions, was drowned in tense silence, broken only by the machines and the sharp orders I gave. Everyone knew there was no margin for error. One of the residents assisting me murmured, almost voiceless, "Doctor, we won't be able to control this." I turned to him and answered firmly, "Yes, we will. He is not leaving us today." It was more than a professional response. It was a promise I made to myself, and in some way, also to the mother waiting outside. We began searching for the main source of the bleeding. We located a severe injury in the mesenteric artery, responsible for irrigating part of the intestine. Each attempt to control the hemorrhage resulted in blood spurting with a force that seemed to mock our efforts. I had participated in many complex surgeries, but that night every step felt like walking on a tightrope about to snap. The anesthesiologist announced again, this time with worry heavy in his voice, "Heart rate dropping. He is in hypovolemic shock." My heart raced. Mentally, I checked the time. We were already in critical minutes. The blood loss was massive, and even with transfusion bags being administered, it seemed we couldn't replace it as fast as he was losing it. At that instant, I faced the limits of medicine. Protocols indicated steps to follow, but Gabriel's body wasn't reacting as expected. Science said the chances were running out, but for some reason I can't explain. I couldn't accept that outcome. I took a deep breath and told the team, "Stay strong. As long as there is a heartbeat, the fight goes on." The words seemed to reignite determination in everyone. Quick movements, firm hands, focused eyes. It was as though, in that moment, the whole room shared a single heartbeat with his. Even so, the vital signs continued to plummet. The monitor, once showing strong, regular waves, began displaying an almost flat line, broken only by weak peaks. The alarms filled the room like a cruel warning. We were about to lose him, and it was precisely when hope seemed gone that something unexpected began to happen. The monitor let out a sharper alarm. The heart line nearly flatlined, and the silence that followed was suffocating. For an instant, everyone in the operating room felt the weight of the inevitable. I looked at Gabriel's open abdomen and his pale face. It was as if life itself had decided to slip through our fingers. I commanded, "Cardiac massage, now." The resident began chest compressions while the anesthesiologist adjusted doses of adrenaline. The entire team was in a state of maximum tension. Each movement seemed to carry the weight of destiny. The wall clock advanced. Relentlessly, and I knew we were exceeding the acceptable limit of time without response. Then it happened. At the peak of that struggle, when logic could no longer sustain hope, I felt a strange calm flood the room. It was as though, for a brief moment, time had slowed down. The alarms sounded distant, the voices muffled. I remember looking at Gabriel's face and, for one unforgettable second, feeling clearly that we were not alone there. I can't explain it. It wasn't something visible, but the atmosphere changed, as if an invisible presence had taken over the room. Some would say it was only adrenaline, others would call it an illusion caused by extreme stress. But inside me, I know there was something beyond. The next instant, against all odds, the monitor beeped loudly. The line that had neared flatness returned to show waves, still weak but alive. Gabriel's heart had resumed its rhythm. One of the residents exclaimed almost in disbelief, "He's back!" The hands that had trembled. From tension now moved with renewed energy. The team worked as though granted a second chance, and finally, we managed to control the bleeding and suture the artery. The hemorrhage gradually ceased, and the vital signs began to stabilize. The mother, outside, had no idea what was happening at that exact moment. But inside the room, we all felt that we had witnessed something rare, something that transcended mere medical technique. As we finished the surgery, a respectful silence took over the room. It wasn't the same silence of despair from the beginning, but rather one of reverence. Every glance exchanged between the team carried the same unspoken question: how was this possible? When the last stitch was placed and the surgical field removed, I took a deep breath and looked at the monitor once more. Gabriel's heart was beating strong, stubborn, as if refusing to give up. At that moment, I knew it had not only been a victory for science. We had witnessed something that defies explanation, something that even with all my years of experience, I cannot put into words. And so, in the early hours of that morning, the thin line between life and death became the testimony of a miracle. When the surgery ended and Gabriel was taken to the ICU, I remained alone in the operating room for a few minutes, sitting on a chair in the corner. The sound of the team's footsteps fading still echoed, but within me there was a profound silence. I had spent years studying, training, building experience in hospitals and surgical centers. I had always trusted science because it gives us concrete tools to fight death. But that night I realized that science is not always enough to explain what we witness. I knew that, statistically, Gabriel should not have survived. The amount of blood lost, the time in hypovolemic shock, the almost null vital signs, everything pointed to a tragic outcome. And yet, he was alive. More than that, he was stable. As I removed my surgical gloves, and looked at my hands still stained with blood, I thought, how many times do we believe we completely control life, when in reality, we are only instruments? I am not saying medicine wasn't essential. Without the team, without the techniques, without each synchronized movement, Gabriel would never have had the chance to come back. But deep down, everyone in that room knew there was something more. A moment that escaped equations, guidelines, and logical explanations. I remember walking out into the hallway and finding his mother sitting on a chair, her trembling hands holding a rosary. When I approached, she lifted her tearful eyes and asked me, almost voiceless, "My son, is he alive?" I felt a knot in my throat, and I answered with the firmness that only truth can carry. "Yes, he is alive." At that instant, she broke down in tears, but they were tears of relief, of gratitude. She grabbed my hands as though I had done something beyond what was humanly possible. But deep down, I knew it wasn't only my merit. This story remains with me to this day because it reminds me of something essential. Medicine is made of science, but also of humanity. We cannot ignore the unexplainable. No matter what each person calls it, faith, energy, destiny, miracle, the fact is, there are moments when the impossible manifests before our eyes. And I want to speak directly to you, who are watching me right now. Perhaps you have been through a situation where there seemed to be no way out. Maybe. You felt the ground vanish under your feet. And yet, something happened. A detail, a coincidence, a force you cannot name, and you managed to move forward. If you've lived that, you understand exactly what I mean. As a doctor, I have learned to value every heartbeat, every breath that insists on continuing. Because life, fragile as it may be, always finds a way to surprise us. And that is what I take from this story. The certainty that we are not owners of destiny. We are only its witnesses. When I left the hospital that morning, the sun was already rising. I was exhausted, shoulders heavy from hours standing, but inside me there was a feeling I cannot describe with words alone. It was a mixture of gratitude, reverence, and humility before what had happened. The image of Gabriel, breathing steadily after everything we went through, was living proof that life always keeps cards we cannot foresee. I had entered that room prepared to fight with all the weapons of science, but I left it. Remembering that sometimes what happens goes far beyond what we learn in books, and that is why I wanted to share this story with you, because I know that at some point in your life, you too have witnessed something that had no explanation, something that touched your heart and made you rethink the world around you. If this story moved you, I want to ask for something very simple, yet very important. Leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear these words, and in the comments write, "I believe in miracles." Your interaction helps this message reach many more people, and maybe, who knows, it could be exactly what someone needs to regain hope today. YouTube only delivers this content if there is engagement, and I need you so that this story reaches those who, right now, may be in need of faith, courage, or even comfort. Because in the end, it doesn't matter whether you are a doctor, a patient, a family member, or simply a curious person. We all carry within us the same certainty. Life is a mystery, and sometimes, before it, all we can do is believe. The first hours after the surgery were filled with uncertainty. Gabriel had resisted the procedure, but his body was still fragile, unstable, like a flame flickering at the slightest breath. The ICU became his new battlefield. I passed by his bed several times to closely follow his progress. The cardiac monitor now showed a regular rhythm, still delicate but steady. The mechanical respirator kept air moving in and out of his lungs, and every movement was carefully observed by the nursing staff with attentive eyes. In that silent environment, interrupted only by the constant beeping of the machines, the scene seemed surreal. To an outsider, he might have looked like just another patient connected to wires and tubes, but to me, who had felt his life slip away, every heartbeat was like the sound of victory. In the hallway, I once again met his mother. This time, she didn't ask anything. She just hugged me, tightly, as if she wanted to thank me without words. I could feel the relief in the trembling of her hands. It was at that moment that I realized something. Sometimes, the hope of a family is the invisible fuel that also sustains a medical team. During the following night, I mentally replayed every detail of the surgery. Had something we did been decisive? Was it the technique, the speed, the synchronicity of the team? Or was there something more? No. Matter how much I sought logical explanations, there was an empty space that no answer could fill. And that emptiness reminded me of something doctors rarely admit. We too feel powerless. We too need to believe that something exists beyond our capacity. 2 days later, Gabriel opened his eyes. His weak voice could barely form words, but I remember perfectly the first whisper that came out of his mouth. "Am I alive?" I smiled, held his hand, and answered, more alive than ever. He had no idea what had happened. He didn't know about the thin line he had crossed, nor about the battle we fought while his heart almost gave up. But maybe that was better. Sometimes a miracle doesn't need to be understood, only lived. And for the team, his recovery was like a silent reminder that it's worth enduring the longest nights, the heaviest shifts, and the hardest battles. Because when life wins, every effort makes sense. In the days that followed, the hospital's atmosphere seemed to have changed. It was not common for a case so severe to have such a positive outcome. The entire team was still talking about what had happened that night. Some called it luck, others a coincidence, but in everyone's eyes I sensed something deeper. They all knew they had witnessed something beyond routine medicine. One of the nurses, who had worked by my side during the surgery, approached me in the hallway and said quietly, "Doctor, I've never seen anything like it." When his vital signs disappeared, I was already prepared to hear you declare the time of death. But when he came back, I felt something I can't explain, as if someone had given his life back on purpose. Those words stayed with me, because they weren't only hers. Other professionals also shared similar impressions. The anesthesiologist, known for his coldness and rationality, admitted, "I'm not the kind to believe in miracles, doctor." But that night, I doubted my own certainties. And me? I was divided too. As a doctor, I had learned to seek scientific explanations for everything. I needed to believe in protocols, in exams, in concrete answers. But as a human being, I could not ignore the feeling that something greater had been at play. At night, alone at home, I thought about how many times I had stood face to face with death. In some cases, I did everything right and still lost patience. In others, like Gabriel's, everything seemed lost, yet life found a gap to hold on. And then I asked myself, how far does science go? And where does the mystery of existence begin? This dilemma was not mine alone. The entire team carried the same restlessness. In the cafeteria, days later, the case was still being discussed. Some said it was God. Others preferred the explanation that his body was young and reacted at the last second. But deep down, everyone knew there was something in that story that did not entirely fit into usual explanations. I also remembered Gabriel's mother. When I told her her son was stable, her eyes shone in a way I will never forget. She didn't thank me like one thanks a doctor. She thanked me as someone who recognized that something had happened beyond understanding. And maybe that is the central point of this story. Medicine gives us instruments, but not all the answers. There are moments when we are forced to accept that life is greater than any manual, greater than any statistic. And I say this with humility. That night, even though I held the scalpel, I was not truly the one. Responsible for saving Gabriel. I was only a witness to something that surpassed all logic. A few days later, I returned to the ICU to visit Gabriel. He was already off the machines, breathing on his own, stronger. When I entered the room, he smiled, still fragile, but alive. "Doctor, my mother said you saved me," he whispered. I looked at him and answered with honesty. "We did our part, but there was something that night that even I cannot explain. You were given a second chance. Make the most of it." His eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of gratitude. And in that moment, I realized this story was not only about surgery, it was about life, and how sometimes the impossible chooses to manifest itself before our eyes. When I left the hospital, I thought about how often we walk through the world believing we control everything. We believe we own our destiny, that we can predict and calculate every step, but deep down, life is full of gaps where mystery seeps through. And when that happens, it doesn't matter who you are, doctor, patient, family, or just a bystander, we are all reminded of our fragility, and at the same time, of the greatness of existence. I never forgot that night in the operating room, and I confess, every time I enter one, I carry with me not only the techniques I learned, but also the reminder that there are forces we do not master. I want to end this story leaving a message for you who are listening. Take care of your life as the most precious. Treasure that exists. Value every heartbeat, every breath, every person who walks beside you. Because in the end, we never know when life will surprise us. And if one day you feel you've reached the limit, remember Gabriel. Remember that even when everything seems lost, there can still be a new beginning. Before I finish, I need to ask, if this story touched you in any way, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these words. And in the comments write, "I believe in miracles." Your interaction helps this message reach many more people, and maybe, just maybe, it will be exactly what someone needs today to regain hope. And don't forget, the next video is already on the way. I won't reveal the theme yet, but I can guarantee it's a story as impactful as this one, perhaps even more. So, stay with me. With each story, you'll realize that life inside a hospital holds secrets, mysteries, and lessons none of us should ignore. Because I am a doctor, and despite all my experience, there are things I will never forget. And this was one of them.